So, why is physicalism wrong? So, what is physicalism, first of all? Physicalism is the idea that subjective mental phenomenon is composed of objective physical phenomenon. It's the idea that basically that your brain is a computer and therefore consciousness. And it is wrong. So why is it that probably most intelligent people these days believe that physicalism is true? The reason why that is because they think that computation is a objective physical phenomenon, when in reality it is not an objective phenomenon at all. It is a subjective projection from your mind onto the physical world. Okay, it is a subjective mental phenomenon, not an objective phenomenon. And probably you'll probably ask, how can this be? Because computation seems to happen in the real world, right? The reality is that is just your opinion on what is happening in the world. So what is computation? Well, computation is that you have input and you compute the input into output. That's all computation is. Okay, and you compute it according to some recipe. And the recipe, of course, in a traditional computer is the software. So what is the input and what is the output? Well, the input and the output are languages. What does that mean? What is a language? A language is a mapping from an objective physical phenomenon to a subjective mental phenomenon. In other words, it is a subjective opinion about what a physical objective phenomenon means, right? So when I say to you the word dog, right, and my mouth makes those sound waves. Does these sound waves, do they objectively mean a four-legged furry creature? No, they don't, right? Because words do not objectively mean what we say they mean. And that's why we have different languages, right? Right. When I say dog or you say dog, we simply have opinions about what that word means. But objectively speaking, that word doesn't mean what we say that it means. You can have an infinite number of subjective opinions about what a physical phenomenon means, but in reality, the object of physical phenomenon is just what it is, and it doesn't mean anything beyond that. And the same is, of course, true with written language. If you write down on a piece of paper a sentence, the words in that sentence, using the symbols that you've written down, do not objectively mean what you have written. So the language in the computer is, of course, in binary, right? And the binary is a base 2 number system, which your computer uses as its alphabet, just as the English language uses the Latin alphabet, and then it builds up more and more complicated information using that alphabet. But the reality is that there are no ones and zeros in the computer. The reality is that the ones and zeros is just a convention that we have. The reality is just an opinion that we project onto it, right? The reality is, of course, that in a computer there are electrical signals. What is an electrical signal? Well, an electrical signal is basically just sequences of high and low voltages. That is what electrical signals are. And for simplicity's sake, let's just say that if a voltage is high, then that's considered a 1. And if it's low, then that's considered a 0. But obviously there is no objective reason why a high voltage should mean 1 and why a low voltage should mean 0, or anything else for that matter. Why shouldn't they be reversed? Why shouldn't the high voltage mean 0 and a low voltage mean 1? Or why shouldn't they mean another number like 544? Or why should it mean a number at all? Why shouldn't it mean the letter A? Or a word? Or the Boolean value of true or false? Or anything else, right? There is no objective reason why these things have to mean one thing or another. So let me give you a simpler example that is going to be easier to see, perhaps. Let's say that you have an abacus, okay, a counting frame. And let's say you take a ring on this counting frame and you drag it all the way to the right, and you say that this ring in this position means 100. Does that ring objectively mean 100 in that position? No. This is arbitrarily defined and subjectively defined. Right? It is your opinion that that ring means 100. But in reality, it doesn't mean anything. Like, you could just as easily define that however you want. However, it is possible to do computation on an abacus, right? How can this be? Well, it's because you can define it. Well, it's because this is how the physical world works, right? You can define what these different rings, what this different physical phenomenon means. And given what you have defined them to mean, that gives you an instruction set. That gives you a certain set of operations that you can perform in order to arrive at a predictable result. Right? So you can do 1,000 steps of computation on an abacus, and you don't even have to understand what you're doing. As long as you follow certain rules that are, of course, given by your instruction set and given by how you defined your states, what these rings mean on this abacus, you can do 1,000 steps of computation, and at the end of that, you will have the correct answer given the computation that you performed, right? But objectively speaking, at no point did any of the rings mean what you say they mean, and at no point were the operations that you performed objectively, and at no point did any of those operations objectively mean what you thought they meant. So let me try to give you an even simpler example. Take your hands, okay? You have 2 hands and you can count on your hands, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, etc., etc. But obviously there's nothing about this that really means 1 or this that really means 2. Objectively speaking, this can mean whatever. It's an arbitrary configuration of matter that doesn't objectively mean anything. I can say that means 2, but it could just as easily just as easily mean B, or it could just as easily mean 544. There is no objective right and wrong answer to what this gesture means. It's an arbitrary configuration of matter. It doesn't have an objective meaning beyond what it is. So I can count, right? And of course, the fact that and given the fact that I define what this to mean 1 and this to mean 2 and this to mean 3, etc., etc., that gives me an instruction set, right? If I raise a finger, that means I'm adding 1. If I lower a finger, that means I'm subtracting 1. So you can do computation on your hands. Obviously, this is not Turing-complete computation, but nevertheless, you can do them on your hands. Right? But objectively speaking, it doesn't have to be that way. This could mean 10, and this could mean 0. Right? So every time I'm lowering a finger, that means I'm adding 1. And every time I raise a finger, that means I'm subtracting 1. So now this is 10, this is 9, this is 8, this is 7, etc., etc. Or why shouldn't each finger mean 2, right? So I can do add and subtract 2. So basically this is 20, or this is 20, depending on how you count. This is 18, this is 16, this is 14, this is 12, this is 10, etc., etc. So, or why shouldn't it be binary, as it is in a computer, right? Why shouldn't this be 1? Why shouldn't this be 0, this be 1, this be 2, this be 3, this be 4, this be 5, this be 6, this be 7, and this be 8? Why shouldn't it be that way? There is no objective reason why it shouldn't be that way. And of course, depending on if you do use that binary interpretation, then that's all of a sudden lowering a finger or raising a finger now takes on a totally different meaning. So it all depends on how you define it and your instruction set. And this is why. This is fundamentally why physicalism is not correct. Okay, it is a subjective opinion that exists in your mind, not in the objective physical world. Okay, it is subjective and it is arbitrary. So here's my 2 questions. Given the fact that this is what computation is, and that it is not an objective physical phenomenon, but a subjective mental phenomenon, it is a subjective opinion about what an objective physical phenomenon means. Given this, how can something that is clearly objective, like my own consciousness, now obviously it's subjective, but nevertheless I'm certain that it exists, right? It objectively exists. Subjectively perhaps, but objectively as well. So how can something that objectively exists be generated from something that is entirely subjective and arbitrary? How can something that objectively exists be generated from something that is entirely opinion? Second of all, and perhaps this is even easier to see, how can you have subjective mental phenomena that are particular and specific be generated from something that is subjective and therefore entirely arbitrary? When I see the color blue, I see the color blue. I don't see the color red. I don't see the color green. Okay, green and blue for me is not switched, and there is no objective reason why it shouldn't be. And why is it that I don't see the blue as feeling somebody touching the back of my hand, or feeling like I'm hearing a sound, or smelling a smell, or feeling it as the emotion of joy or pain, when it is not anchored to anything that is objective? It is entirely subjective, entirely arbitrary. Physicalism is entirely wrong. And this is what I realized in my mid-20s. So that's why physicalism is wrong. You would have to be a fool to believe it. And yet, all the intelligent people in today's world seem to believe it, and it's totally wrong, and provably so. And obviously, once you understand that, obviously that opens up a lot of very terrifying doors that you have to consider very carefully, because if physicalism is wrong, then there are only 2 other options: idealism and dualism. And nobody believes in idealism. Idealism is the idea that Idealism is the idea that the objective physical world is generated by you. Okay. Basically, basically, the objective physical world does not exist outside of your experience of it, right? And the problem with this, of course, is that you lack the attributes that I think you would expect if that was the case. Attributes like being omniscient, omnipotent, infinite, which I think you would probably expect to be if there was nothing outside of you to restrain you. Having knowledge of generating the objective world, being outside of time, right? Obviously, I exist in the context of time, which means that the time is objective to me, right? Obviously, I don't experience time existing within me. I experience existing in the context of time. So ultimately, I'm not the ultimate context, right? I'm not the uncaused cause. I'm not the root node in this hierarchical tree graph. And that's why idealism is wrong. And then you have dualism. And in dualism, you basically have two possibilities, and that's panpsychism. The idea that everything is conscious. Obviously, idealism is the idea that subjective mental phenomenon composes objective physical phenomenon, right? So it's the reverse of physicalism. Dualism is the idea that both objective physical phenomenon and subjective mental phenomenon both exist and are separate from each other. In other words, you cannot derive one from the other. In other words, they are at least equally fundamental. And the other possibility in dualism is monotheism. And monotheism is by far the best option. But that's a different story. That's a different video that will be made at a different time.